This lecture is part 2 of our week 6 lecture on dealing with gambling and other behavioral addictions. So previously we were talking about cyber addiction, focused on internet addiction, being preoccupied, excessive amounts of time, video games, things of that nature. Of course, the sexual components of that in terms of online pornography. And a useful way to think about and to kind of treatment and approaching it this way is to think about this acronym frames. First, feedback. And so we need to think about how we assess their use of and the feedback they've received on problematic internet use. What kinds of websites do they see? How much time do they devote to online activities, and how that is impacting negatively their work lives, social lives, that kind of thing. I always laugh when we hear during Cyber Monday, just the loss of productivity because people are shopping on Amazon.com, that kind of a thing. And there's also this sense of responsibility that people are choosing their devices, their activities, right? They have responsibility for those activities. Advice in terms of helping alongside and helping the client to set goals in terms of treatment. We need to help them develop different and options for self-directed change. What are menus that we can give them? What are alternative activities, alternative practices, alternative behaviors that they can engage of, specifically focused on kind of the goal of their addictive behavior? Are they bored and then their online activity is exciting to them? Is this about comfort and escape, that kind of thing? And so what are some other alternatives, menus, activities that we can provide or support them in to alter their behaviors? And so it could also be kind of consequence things connected to things like, monitoring their computer use, for example. Empathy is an important component of that, trying to understand what they're going through and their experiences. Also fostering empathy on their part in terms of thinking about what is the effect of their activity on their significant others, that kind of a thing. And ultimately, especially with internet addiction, we can think about the spiritual connections there, right? So the more and more spiritual but not religious the culture has become, the more secular versus sacred, right? That God-shaped space that all of us have in our souls needs to be filled. And the internet is a place that has lots of things that can be used to fill those empty spaces in our lives. And of course, it's consuming, right? Once we begin to use those things to fill our spiritual dryness, our spiritual emptiness, then they get more and more space in our lives, and they take more and more of our time and opportunity and money and treasure, and they take more and more of our attention, and they become idols. And so then understanding that empathy piece to that, its connection with the spiritual dimensions of internet addiction in particular, is an important component of understanding the process where that person is being filled but not fulfilled, right? They're consuming but they're not being satiated. That's that kind of an idea. And then of course self-efficacy, right? People need to understand that they have a lot of effortful control over the behaviors that they're engaging in, right? It might feel compulsive, it might feel like you have no control, but actually as therapists we can support them to improve in their self-efficacy that way. Some harm reduction strategies for internet addiction, getting a timer, right, and then following through when the time 5 minutes goes off, remove ourselves from different email lists and online notifications, that kind of stuff, right? We need to really cut back and put barriers in place to reduce the amount of attention that we give the internet. Sex addiction is another important component here, and sometimes sex addiction is associated with risk-taking behavior, right? There's always that potential of getting caught, in terms of dealing with one's significant other, or what's being viewed on the computer, that kind of a thing. Cognitive therapy is a useful tool to address sexual addiction, so we can think about it in terms of a ever expanding desire, right? So sexuality is a God-given natural thing. With sex addiction, that God-given natural desire is driven towards inappropriate objects at some points. It violates interpersonal boundaries around marriage, around a Christian understanding of sexuality, and even if you're not a Christian, though, sex addiction expands, right? The more energy it's given, the more space it takes in one's life, and the more boundaries it tends to push. Consequently, there's a lot of secrecy associated with it, and of course, how that's connected with famous examples, Tiger Woods, President Clinton, and their sexual behaviors, that kind of thing. And of course, engaging in self-help is another important one. Sex Addicts Anonymous is a useful tool, because the sex addiction part is connected to something that's really important for human flourishing, human nature, and it's just a target. It's a God-given, motivating and important piece to why people interact and engage in relationships, and it gets thwarted, sex addiction, of course, violates individual well-being, the well-being of communities and relationships as well. So, as we're thinking about, generally speaking, the idea of how do we facilitate change, one of the best empathic parts or approaches to change is the stages of change by Prakash and Norcross. And so the first step is pre-contemplation, and that's where a lot of clients will come in. They don't even acknowledge that there's a problem that needs to be changed. So for the sex addict or the gambler, maybe there is feedback in their life that's saying that they do have a problem, but they don't believe it. They're denying the extent and the power that this behavior has in their life, right? So they don't understand. So as therapists, we need to come alongside them and begin to support them in thinking about, okay, is this? So I know you say you don't have a problem, and I appreciate your perspective, and I understand the role that gambling, the role that the internet, binge watching Netflix shows or whatever it plays in your life, right? We can think about how that's about comfort or escape or excitement, but begin the process of asking them, could these other people be right? Right? It's not just your mom saying this. It's your boss. It's the judge. It's, your significant other. It's your children. They're like, well, where are you? And, we had a karate event and you missed another one, right? You missed my belt ceremony again. So, that's important to me, Dad. Why aren't you there? That kind of a thing. So let's begin the process of helping them to examine objectively the feedback, and the space that they're given in to the substance or to this behavior in their life. Right? Once enough of that has happened, they begin to acknowledge that there is a problem. They begin the contemplation stage. Right? They're not yet ready or sure of wanting a change, or they might lack confidence to make the change. Right? So okay, I know that I have a problem, but I don't know what to do about it. Right? So that's an important and different place to be in, as opposed to, I don't even have a problem. These other people, they're crazy. They're just out to get me, or they're mean, or whatever. And so the contemplation stage indicates that, they're starting to acknowledge, I have this problem. Help. What can I do about it? Because I don't want my relationships to be destroyed. I don't want to give so much space to the internet or pornography. Preparation/determination. They start to develop a plan with their therapists and their communities of support to make the change. the next stage is the action stage, where they actually begin to make those changes. And then the maintenance stage is where they begin to maintain their behavior. Now, the way that this is presented here, pre-contemplation down to maintenance, seems like it's a progressive piece, but people, in my experience, vacillate back and forth, and it's very useful as a therapist because it helps me understand that maybe the person isn't ready to make X, Y, and Z changes, but they are ready to make B, C, and D changes. So let's work on B, C, and D, right? But we will come back to the X, Y, and Z later. And so it helps me as a therapist be flexible in my approach to them. It helps me to emphasize their self-efficacy and their autonomy, right? They're more in charge of the process. And at the same time, we get to really have good conversations about all of the things that are going on in the client's life about this. And in terms of the contemplation, the preparation stage, it helps me identify things that the client's willing to do. In my experience in working with lots of different clients, when the client was given a suggestion, or there was a part of the treatment plan that the client didn't buy into, or they weren't motivated about, it didn't fit for them for some reason, that those parts of the treatment plans didn't work. So this kind of approach to stages of change that's very collaborative in orientation really helps us to identify things the clients can do and are willing to do, which leads to success. Cognitive therapy for all of these behavioral approaches, addictions rather, are very useful. They help us to identify the thought patterns that are associated with their addictions, especially anorexia, and so that's a helpful way to go. And it can be integrated into a stages of change approach. It helps also to cognitive therapy also helps us to put parameters and boundaries on increasingly extreme behavior, right? There's an escalation that is associated with all kinds of addiction processes. We can think about some of the important slogans of AA: one day at a time, easy does it, that kind of a thing. And so it helps us to not put too much pressures on ourselves to make therapeutic changes too quickly. And of course, there's a heavy focus on the cerebral, the cognitive, rational motive behavioral therapy, mindfulness approaches, that kind of a thing, right? And so we want to. Sometimes we do need to confront our clients, especially in addiction. However, I would tend to move from a more gentle approach, assuming they're in the pre-operational stage, as opposed to going in and being highly confrontational from the beginning, right? We want to make sure that our therapeutic relationship can support those kinds of difficult and hard conversations we'll have later. Cognitive therapy teaches clients to avoid black and white thinking. We can also ask about times of client success. Yeah, you mentioned, for example, a question in this vein could be, you mentioned in our last session that there were times in your life when you had more control, or where you felt you had more of control over your addiction. What were those times? What was going on for you? What was that success like? That kind of thing. We want to use regular assessments, which we will talk about in a future lecture. We also want to focus on the emotional or the feeling components to that, how your affect is a part of your cognition, and how that is also involved in the addiction process. And of course, stress management. A lot of addictions, behavioral, especially are used for emotion regulation strategies. So how can we really, really focus on stress management and support the person to do that, right? So again, when we're dealing with a gambling addiction or a sexual addiction or an internet addiction, we want to think about how that plays a specific psychological role in the person's life and need. And then we want to provide alternative ways to meet that need as we are moving away from the problematic behavior, right? We don't want to take away a problematic behavior. without building in some kind of support system. That's going to lead to failure as a therapist, and it's going to ultimately reinforce any sense of helplessness that the client may have already. Therapy should be positive in terms of reframing their behaviors, address their negative self-talk to develop more positive self-talk. Cognitive therapy can also focus on the past. There's an associated feeling work, especially anger as a cover to other more primary emotions. That way includes stress management, and then of course group work is very effective. So this concludes part 2 of our behavioral addictions, or gambling and internet addictions. If you have any questions, please email me, and I hope this video lecture has been helpful. Thank you very much.